Thank you for joining us today. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. This is Insightful Leader Live. I'm Jess Love, Editor-in-Chief of Kellogg Insight and host of our podcast, The Insightful Leader. We're actually going to be back next week, next Thursday, to talk with Professors Lauren Nordgren and David Schoenthal on why people are so resistant to change and how to innovate anyway. Today, the always insightful Craig Garthwaite. He's going to take us through the ever-evolving American healthcare ecosystem. Before we get started, some housekeeping. Right now, folks are using the chat function to tell us where you're from. Love it. We will be changing the settings soon. Your messages will only go to those of us behind the scenes. So you can use that for any tech issues that may come up. If you have questions for Professor Garthwaite, please use the Q&A box. You can also upvote questions from other attendees. Closed captioning is available. You can access it via live transcript in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. And finally, this event will be recorded. Everyone who registers will get a link to a video of this presentation in about 24 hours. Without further ado, the US healthcare system is a lot of things. It is very much a business, which is why I'm so glad we're going to be hearing from Professor Garthwaite today. Craig Garthwaite is a leading healthcare economist, as well as the director of the program on healthcare at Kellogg. His research on the business of healthcare has appeared in many top journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and the American Economic Review. His commentary is also highly sought after in media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and NPR's Marketplace. And of course, he has a very lively Twitter feed where he discusses all things healthcare and, believe it or not, a bit of cooking. You can find him at C_Garthwaite. So welcome, Professor Garthwaite.
All right, thank you for having me. Wanted to share my slides. Yes, Jess is right. My Twitter feed has a almost equal mix of cooking and healthcare, so I try and satisfy all audiences. But it's really great to join you guys here today to talk about United States healthcare. U.S. healthcare and healthcare overall, it's a large and sort of ever-changing system. It continues to evolve, it continues to change, these sort of fits and starts. But throughout it all, there's a common theme that these changes are really driven by the incentives in the system and the degree to which those incentives drive behavior. Some of those incentives are financial, some of those incentives are non-financial, related to providers. And really what I want to think about is sort of in how we approach healthcare at Kellogg is thinking about how we can use sort of the fundamentals of business to understand this sort of broad sector. To make sense, we're sort of, on the same page here. The first thing we want to talk about is that healthcare in the United States is really big, right? So healthcare is about 18% of the US economy. That makes it roughly equal to the size of Germany. So when you're thinking about sort of, disrupting the US economy or US healthcare economy, you want to think about equivalently, you're saying, doing something like disrupting the economy of Germany. And it just helps understand the degree to which we are really talking about just a massive sector in the United States. And then if we want to think about change, we want to think about how this system is going to move and evolve, or how we can try and help it move and evolve, you want to think about this sort of how we think about steering a large ship. Right? We're not turning this cruise ship on a dime, right? You can sort of see the path behind it. Know that if you don't end up thinking about this carefully, there are a lot of, much like the Evergreen we learned with the Suez Canal, there are a lot of bad things that can happen. And so context is going to be a really important thing to think about when it comes to any conversation we have about the world of healthcare in the United States. And so that should make us think for a second then about what do we even mean when we say healthcare? This is a chart from McKinsey that I really like. So the width of every sort of vertical here represents the share of overall healthcare profits that sector of healthcare captures. So be it delivery systems or manufacturers like pharmaceutical companies. And then the height of every rectangle within is where the sort of subsector captures. You can see hospitals capturing a lot of money overall, given the size of their rectangle. But the first thing you should really see here is just when we say healthcare, it's a bit of a misnomer. There is no healthcare business. There are a bunch of businesses and business models that exist within United States healthcare. And that requires, if you want to think about what does change look like or how do I successfully operate within healthcare, to really think about these different business models, to internalize the fact that the business model for a hospital, which is relatively low margin with a ton of profit going, or a ton of patients going through, is very different from the risky IP-centric scientific world of biopharma. And that when we call them all healthcare, we really should be thinking about the fact that these are different but interconnected businesses. Right? And that said, that interconnected point is something that is important and is just becoming more important over time. So we present a chart like this that has these silos in healthcare, but then we start to note that this siloed view of healthcare really doesn't reflect what we're seeing in the contemporary market, that firms are really trying to organize a bunch of different activities in the same firm. And so each column here represents the common assets within a corporate firm. And a lot of it is driven, this activity, by the activity of United Health Group, located sort of north of us up in Minnesota, where United is active as both an insurer, as a pharmacy benefit manager, as an operator of specialty pharmacies where you get medicines, and increasingly as a medical provider themselves with their Optum Care unit, employing or affiliating with up to 50,000 doctors at this point, making one of the largest employers of physicians in the country. We see the same thing with Aetna, with its acquisition of CVS. We see the same thing with Humana, right, which recently just closed a deal to acquire the rest of Kindred at Home for $8 billion to become one of the nation's largest home health providers. It's a reorganization of the sector. And I'm going to talk a bit about why that's happening and what's driving it and what it means going forward. We're also seeing new firms enter into this sector, right? There's probably, I would estimate, about $30 billion worth of valuation on this screen right now. All of these are primary care firms, or firms that offer primary care services that you almost uniquely now are taking on full medical risk for their enrollees. So they are primary care doctors, but they are responsible for all of the spending of their patients. And they plan to make money by driving down the cost of those patients. If you compare this slide and this together, you start to see that there's a ton of new business models that are emerging here. And they're all being driven to try and change what's going. And therefore, because of these business models, because of the degree to which this is becoming an interconnected sector that we have to think about, success requires embracing the degree to which you must engage with the rest of the healthcare sector, where everyone sort of fits together at this point. For a long time, you would think about the biopharmaceutical sector of healthcare. It sort of sat off on its own. It developed drugs. It interacted with payers and doctors a bit to get those drugs to market, but it really wasn't ingrained into the provision of healthcare services. And I work a lot with biopharmaceutical companies. We have a lot of alums that work at these companies, and you talk to them, and they're like, yeah, I don't need to know about hospitals or payers. Like, I just sort of do my thing. I make my products, and my products are good enough that they'll be sold. But increasingly, what we're realizing is that the complexity and the cost of healthcare and the new products that we are developing is changing that fact. Consider the world of sort of gene therapy or CAR T, right? This path here, this is the patient path for sort of a typical drug, a pill, a biologic, right? You look all the way over to the right, you've got this treatment decision, the payer approves it, you infuse it, you make sure that there are no adverse events. This is what it looks like to get someone a gene therapy product. Now they need to be referred. Where are they going to get infused? Is someone going to cover it at that site? How are we going to get the sample? How are we going to process it? How are we going to infuse it? How are we going to do adverse event monitoring? And now it's you, the provider, the payer, all working as complements. And now as a pharmaceutical company, you've got to think about hospitals where they need to get paid for taking part in the process of getting these really innovative products into the bodies of people where they can actually help. And that's that. Now you have to respect their business model. You have to respect their incentives. You have to work with them. Or consider the world of precision medicine. Loxo Oncology, now a division of Eli Lilly, makes fantastic oncology products, and they were bought by Lilly for about $8 billion. They make a great drug, a set of drugs. They're for a very particular set of patients that have a very specific DNA mutation, and they're sort of site agnostic. So it's not a treatment for breast cancer, but it's a treatment for a tumor with this particular, or for someone who has a particular genetic profile. Well, how do you get patients then if you're Loxo? We estimate that there's sort of like in the 4-digit number of people who this drug is appropriate for. But for those people, it's amazingly successful. How do you identify those patients? Well, now you've got to screen a bunch of people with really expensive genetic tests to try and figure out if they were the right person, right? Loxo has to convince more doctors to order these tests that can cause $5,000 or more. With the price going down now with innovation, but still a lot of money, so much that insurers often say that these tests are experimental because they're diagnostic. They're not treating anything per se. And now you have to think about, how do I get coverage of this DNA test in addition to then getting coverage of my product? How do I get the doctor to have the incentive to think about and the education to invest in this? And now the idea of how you think about dealing with physicians in your pharmaceutical detailing and how they deal with their insurers and whether they have any incentive to take part in that is all changing. And so the world is combining. We are seeing an evolution of the ecosystem. It's no longer the vertical world that we had before. And when worlds change like that, you have to think about how you create value in that market. And that's where it comes back to sort of the fundamentals of business education and business principles applied to healthcare. It's a controversial statement that healthcare is a business. People don't like it to be, right? But fundamentally, and really no matter where you are, right, it is a part of a business sector where people rely on incentives and they rely on economics for the allocation of resources. In some places, the government is more involved. In some places, the government is less involved. But fundamentally, it relies on the incentives and the principles of business. You need to think about that when you go forward. That said, the reason I say it's controversial is healthcare is also quite unique. But we should never forget that. When I teach students, I see a number of students that have jumped on this and former students, right? They get sick of me saying you should always remember that at its basis, a lot of healthcare is buying and selling life and death. And there is a solemn nature to that. You have to think about that. You have to think about that not just to be respectful of what you are doing, but also the fact that that should shape the nature of your strategy as well. It's not just that healthcare is big. That's not the only reason we pay attention to it. Yes, it's 18% of the economy. Yes, it's the size of Germany, but it's also one of the most personal aspects of the economy as well. And that's going to influence how you think about your strategy evolving in this area. And so if I've convinced you now, right, that the system is changing and why it's changing, there should be an immediate question you are thinking about, which is, why is it changing so much now? What is driving this period of change? And I would say, in every 10 years, I feel like we say, this is the time when healthcare is going to fundamentally change. And so I guess it's time for me to now step in and say, I think this actually is the time that healthcare is going to actually change. I think it's being driven by a couple of forces. I think the complexity of medicine and the medical community and the business of healthcare is as high as it's ever been in history. If you think about what we can do for people now, right? If you think about how, even from the 1960s and 70s, the world of healthcare has evolved. Right? I always think about the fact that we created Medicare in 1965, and we left prescription drugs out of the Medicare benefit because it wasn't a meaningful part of healthcare at that point. Think about now, about the way in which prescription drugs are such an integral part about how we improve the livelihood of people, how we think about generating real value in society. So the world has changed a lot. Those drugs have gotten more complicated in the way that we know about the human genome now. We know about the human body and what we can do. But there's also the fact that healthcare has gotten very expensive. And this is a chart that I am contractually obligated as a health economist to include in every talk that I have. There's two. They're going to come back to back. I'm going to knock that requirement out right now. But this compares U.S. healthcare spending compared to the rest of the developed world, comparable countries it's referred to in the chart. And there's no question that we spend more in the United States than other countries do in aggregate, but also as a share of our GDP. And that becomes almost multiplicative because we're such a big economy and we are spending more of that economy on healthcare than other people. And the question I often get asked is like, well, don't you see this as a problem? It's not a question, a statement. I'm told this is a problem. And I will say, it's not a problem per se. We are a rich nation. We are one of the richest nations in the history of the world. If we want to, we can afford to spend this much on healthcare. At a certain point, what else are we going to spend our money on as a society than making ourselves healthier? And so the question is sort of, is 18% the right number? Should it be 16? Should it be 20? The question is fundamentally, are we getting value for money? It's not a question about whether we're spending too much, but are we getting what we want for our money? And that takes us to the other chart that I'm required to show you, which is this relationship between how much we spend per capita on healthcare and what our average life expectancy is. You can see all the other countries in the world basically fall in this nice smooth line. And then there's the United States over there, USA number one, right? Where we spend the most, but we don't get the return in terms of length of life. Now, I will note that this chart always gets shown in a talk like this, and I find it is a fundamentally unfair chart. If we had more time together, I could walk through the variety of ways in which life expectancy is not purely the result of the healthcare system. That there are a lot of things in healthcare or in life expectancy that are about the amount of trauma that people experience. In the United States, we like our guns, we like our fast cars, we like our alcohol and drugs, and we like every convex combination of that together. And that's a meaningful difference in the length of life here versus other countries. We can talk about income inequality and how that can affect the length of life for individuals. Where in the United States, the top and the bottom of the income percentile or the income distribution has a 10-year difference in their average length of life. That's not just because of healthcare. That's a bit about what it means to be poor and what it means to be poor in America. And so this doesn't actually describe whether the United States is a good or a bad system. But I'll also say that there's a lot of truth here if you want to think about are we getting value for money? Are we getting the most efficient healthcare system that we want for the dollars that we spend? And that should immediately lead us to a question about, well, what's driving this high spending? And it's not, this isn't a complicated economic theory talk, right? There's two things. It's got to be prices or it's got to be quantity, right? That's what's going to lead to spending. Is it quantity? This chart's a little complicated to show you in this setting, but this is sort of ranking different countries based on, exactly how much they do different medical procedures. Yellow is the United States. And the thing I want you to take away from that is that in general, the United States is over towards the top end of this distribution. We do a lot of medical procedures here. We offer a lot of choice, and a particular choice about discretionary procedures. We do a lot of knee replacements. We do knee replacements quickly. If you want a procedure in the United States, you can often get these discretionary or procedures very well. In fact, the place where the US really differentiates itself on access in terms of waiting time is far more on elective procedures than it is on emergency procedures. There's a lot of cost that goes in to generating that capacity. But if we really want to focus on what's different between the United States and other countries, we've got to talk a bit about price. Price is a clear differentiating feature from the US market and other people. And that's true in other countries. And that's true if you want to think about healthcare services like childbirth, like knee replacements, like appendectomies, like hip replacements. It's also true if you want to think about healthcare products like prescription drugs. It's a well-discussed point that we pay vastly more than other countries for prescription drugs. And so if you want to think then that prices are driving a lot of the difference, well, then we have to have a conversation about, well, why are prices so high and so varied, so high in the United States and so varied across countries? What's driving that difference? And thinking about that really should take you to the heart of what you think prices do in a market. And I would say that I would contend that prices do at least two things in a market. The first thing they can do is they can separate up the amount of economic value created into profits for the firm and consumer surplus, the happy feeling for patients that they get when they're spending less than the most they would ever pay for a product. That's one thing prices do. And if this was just about allocating surplus, we could say, hey, we'll talk a bit about this. Maybe we can do something to regulate prices. But prices also serve a valuable incentives or provide valuable incentives in the market. A role they have is to make people understand how much they should invest, how much quality should they provide, what market should they choose to enter or exit, and therefore prices are signals. And separating between those two roles is important for what you want to think about the role of prices in this market. Extreme price variation, both within and across countries for healthcare, is often cited as a reason why we should have some form of regulation. They really result from the unregulated market power of hospitals and other providers. And often that argument rests on the amount of mergers and acquisitions we have had in this sector. And I want to be very clear, full stop, that we have had a massive amount of merger activity in the hospital sector, for example. And I would also note that we know that those mergers lead to high prices. This is a chart I'll return to a couple of times, which is sort of a correlation between the private prices paid in the market and various aspects of the market. And there's no doubt we see here that hospitals that are a monopoly, a duopoly, or a triopoly, they have 1, 2, or 3 firms, they're going to have higher prices than more competitive hospital markets. I think it's clear we need robust antitrust activity to think about these markets and what we want to do about it. The thing is, though, if the consolidation was driving price increases, right, that might mean that these meaningful calls for regulation might be okay. If everything we saw in the market in terms of prices was the result of sort of unchecked consolidation, in some ways, life would be a lot easier. But that's not true. As I said earlier, we see that prices serve this incentive for quality in the market. And in that setting, you have to think a lot more carefully. If we return back to that chart, right, we can also see that various indicators of hospital quality are also associated with higher prices on this chart. Things like the number of technologies you have, things like your ranking in the US News and World Report, pure process measures like the number of heart attack patients that get aspirin, the number of patients that are given prophylactic antibiotics prior to surgery, those are also regulated or are also associated with much higher prices. To dig into this question a little more, my colleagues, Chris Odie, and now a newly tenured professor at Kellogg, Amanda Stark, who we're super happy was just awarded tenure by the university. We looked at this a little bit more expressly and we said, okay, let's try and think about how do people respond to incentives in this market? And let's say, well, do we see a relationship between the amount of quality in the market for a hospital and the number of privately insured patients that the hospital could reasonably attempt to attract? Knowing that hospital markets are really local. And so the number of private patients that surround your hospital gives you a sense of the market you could really hope to attract. And then we said, let's think of all of these measures of quality that we can think about and see, is there an upward relation to this? As you have more private patients you can serve, do you offer higher quality to those markets? We see this with something called the hospital care composite score. It's a bunch of different measures, right? Things like 28-day mortality, things like do you give prophylactic antibiotics, things like do you give beta blockers when people leave the hospital, all measures of quality, strong relationship. We looked at where people like to go on Medicare. What hospitals do they prefer, right? You're a better hospital on that measure if you have more private patients in your market. You adopt more technology if you have the chance to serve more private patients. You have cardiologists from better medical schools if you could attract more privately insured patients. Where privately insured patients here are the places where the profit margin is going to be high, right? We have a measure of, from my colleague Amitabh Chandra and co-authors, a measure of hospital productivity that also is going to be higher, right? And then actually this one's going to be lower. How long do you wait in the ER? Do you have short wait times in the ER? You do in places where you have more privately insured patients, or the ability to attract that. And so we can see here that the hospitals are responding to incentives. They are providing more quality in search of more profit. This is a market working. This is how we would expect the market to work. And we can talk a bit about how well the market works in the United States, right? We can talk about sort of whether the market's the sort of efficient way of trying to provide service. But I'll note the market here is working. People are responding to price incentives. And so we want to then think about what are the implications for interfering in that market. To think about that, we also have to think about, well, what are the barriers to the market working better? What's stopping the market from working well? People think that we're spending too much on healthcare. There's some inefficiency that we want to think about. The first thing we could think about is that patients in the United States primarily buy healthcare services with the use of health insurance. So while the United States is unique among its industrialized counterparts, with the number of people in the United States that lack insurance, the vast majority of healthcare spending is still done by the insured. You're either buying insurance directly, you're getting it as a fringe benefit from your employer, so you're giving up some wages in order to get insurance from your employer, or you're getting it from the government, with both Medicare and Medicaid being the two largest programs for that. Medicare providing healthcare primarily for the elderly, but also for some disabled, and Medicaid for low-income individuals and a vast majority of pregnant women, or majority of pregnant women in the United States. And so that's when people are getting health insurance. Why does that matter? Well, health insurance can be a source of inefficiency because the person making the purchase decision at times is not bearing the full cost of the care that they are getting. It's particularly true under a social insurance system where you're not even paying a premium, right? You're just sort of involved in getting access to healthcare from your insurer. And so we might be worried that that distorts the purchase decision. And so what have we done to solve that? Well, we try to turn patients into shoppers. That's been our goal. Right, how have we done that? Well, most of you who are here in the US audience know about this. It's various forms of cost sharing, co-payments, co-insurance, deductibles, right? We've really tried to use that as a tool to control use. That's sort of the goal that we have with those programs or with that cost sharing. And that's nowhere is that more true than the world of pharmaceuticals. It's probably the place where I think we see the most conversation about out-of-pocket payment, even for insured patients. And you can see why that's the case, right? On this chart, we can see that while hospital spending makes up a large fraction of U.S. healthcare spending, more out-of-pocket payments are coming from people who are buying prescription drugs. You are more exposed to the cost of your prescription drugs than you are to other healthcare services. And there are a lot of reasons why we sort of gotten to this point. But a lot of it is we think that we can control the use of these products with various forms of cost sharing. The thing is that increasingly our academic evidence is showing, and this is the thing I personally have updated a ton on. If I gave this talk 7 years ago, there would have been a much younger Craig that said, we need to make patients customers. I might have used the ghoulish phrase, we need them to have some skin in the game. Right? That's what we need. We need them to sort of really think like a customer. But what we're finding, and we need to adapt our approach as we get new academic evidence, is that that's not what's happening. Putting cost sharing on people doesn't appear to turn them into some savvy customer that's ready to navigate sort of this healthcare landscape and really allocate their healthcare dollar as much as they want. In fact, we see that the more we put cost sharing on people, the worse we've made their health. And it varies a bit of sort of what type of cost sharing it is. From my colleague at Harvard, Amitabh Chandra and Evan Flack and Ziad Obermeyer at Berkeley have this great study, right? And they're looking at the degree to which the increase in cost sharing in Medicare has actually cost people's lives. And the important thing, and the thing that maybe has caused me to update the most when it comes to cost sharing, is it turns out that even very small increases in the cost sharing we give people affects utilization. And people just sort of pull back from the market entirely. So people stop taking drugs that are cheap and we know that they should take. Blood pressure medication, right? We know you should take it. It's mainly a generic. We know it, we know that it's going to be good for you. People pull back and then we see an increase in mortality for that. And what we've seen is sort of like, we thought we were so smart when we did cost sharing. We thought we're going to come in with this little scalpel, right? In reality, we've come in with this machete. Right? We've just sort of whacked the market. We don't think carefully about how we impose cost sharing. We put really high cost sharing on drugs like insulin that arguably should have negative cost sharing. We should be paying you to take that drug because it improves your health and we don't have to think about the long-term or pay for the long-term health consequences. But we haven't done that. And there are a variety of market features why that's the case. Part of it, and I would argue, is sort of the unconnected nature of the market. That the people maybe making the decision about how much you have in cost sharing on drugs are not the same people who are thinking about how much you're going to spend in medical care if you don't get access to the right medicine. Let's get some examples about what we mean about that outside of pharmaceuticals. This is from my colleagues, Fiona Scott Morton at Yale and Zach Cooper at Yale and Mike Chernow at Harvard. This is a great paper looking at how people buy MRIs. MRIs are sort of a nice service to talk about because it's relatively self-contained. It's relatively easy to understand. Maybe we don't think there are huge, and with all apology to all radiologists who might be in the audience, we don't think there's huge variation in the quality. We're talking about something like a lower limb MRI, like for your knee that hurts. Like we think you can get those pretty much anywhere. And we see this wide variation in the market. This chart is showing how much variation is there in the market. And these are actual prices paid for an insurer. The red is a hospital-based MRI. The blue is a non-hospital-based MRI. And the black dots you see there give you the amount of volume there. So first thing we see is that the most expensive place is a hospital, and it's a place doing the most MRIs in the market. That's not surprising. This is probably true in happens to be one hospital referral market or referral region. This is going to be true in every market you go to. You have really expensive hospitals, you have less expensive places you can go otherwise. But the question is, like, why do we see people moving over to these high-priced places? Why is there so much volume there? So the authors then went to ask a question, well, what is this costing patients? And I want to zoom in on the center of this chart here, which is trying to get a sense of, if we told patients you don't have to go any further, which just includes you can actually drive a shorter distance, what could you have saved under your insurance contract? And we've made you a shopper. We've put cost sharing on top of you. What could you have saved? You could have saved over $80 not driving any further. You could have saved nearly $120 if you only drove 15 minutes further. This is another chart that helps you start to think that maybe it's not cost sharing that's going to get us there. And you should immediately start thinking, well, why are these people doing this? Who doesn't want $80 more to drive no further, or maybe to drive shorter? And you start to get a sense that maybe something else other than their cost sharing is driving their purchase decision. And you might start to argue that it might be the doctor, right? So this is about your doctor. Are they vertically integrated with the hospital or not? And we see the independent providers, the ones in blue, are far more likely to send you to a non-hospital-based MRI than is an integrated doctor, someone who works for the hospital, who's far more likely to send you to the more expensive hospital-based MRI. And so again, it might not be right. Cost sharing, right, might be failing, not because incentives don't work, because we've been targeting the wrong person with the incentives. That the person we should be looking at is the provider. Then they have a lot of influence on your healthcare decision. However much we want you to be a shopper, even as a shopper of healthcare services, you're not trying to get the cheapest thing you can get. You want to get better. Being sick is scary, right? Something is out of your control. You've picked this doctor because you trust her, right? You trust her to make the right decision. And so then, right, you're going to say, well, for $80, am I going to go to the wrong place? Is that worth it? What if this is a more serious MRI? What if it's a more serious condition? Do I want to really go down from the drug that I was prescribed because I want to save 15 or 20 bucks? Or do I want to listen to the physician that I picked to guide me through this process? And so maybe what we need to think about is that the incentives need to be on the provider. And maybe we start to need to think about that we've got a couple of tools in our bag. Those who are parents know, we've got carrots and sticks to deal with people, right? I think a lot of our reform on our attempts to sort of influence providers to date have been much more about the stick than the carrot. Prior authorization. I'm just going to make it hard for you to prescribe this treatment. And so you're only going to do it for the people who need it most. Maybe we should be thinking more about carrots. I'm going to make it more profitable for you if you do the thing that is evidence-based. You do the thing that we believe is the right thing for the patient. And so maybe it's about changing the nature of the incentives we have. In some ways, then you get this point of it's not surprising we are where we are. Right? There's a quote that economists use a lot and other people in business, right? The folly of rewarding A and hoping for B. We have had a fee-for-service system, a system where if you do more, you get more, right? And so doctors are incentivized to think about getting you to the right place, about keeping you as a patient. They have no incentive to make you, like if they're referring you to an MRI, to pick the place that might be cheaper. She doesn't get any more as a physician if she sends you to the cheaper place. And maybe that itself is the problem. And that takes us fundamentally to payment reform, to think about how we pay for things might allow us to get a more efficient outcome when it comes to healthcare services. And so payment reform is really about changing the nature of what we pay for. Really, it's about changing how we pay for things into various types of bundles that you want to think about. Instead of individually paying for everything that you're going to do, we're going to give someone a lump sum of money to take care of you for that medical episode. And that episode could be something as simple as a colonoscopy or a knee replacement, or as complicated as all of your healthcare spending for the year. And we're going to give someone control over that. And if they can reduce spending, then they're going to be able to earn more money. And so really payment reform, which is a ton of terms that we throw around about it, ACOs, MSSP, value-based care, Medicare Advantage, capitation. There's nothing health economists like more than coming up with acronyms to try and make ourselves seem smart when we're in conversations like this. But the reality is it comes down to two questions that we want to think about, right? One is, what services are we going to bundle together? And the other is, how much are we going to pay for those services? And a lot of what we've seen at the start of sort of this march to value-based care, which is one of those terms that everyone uses, everyone has different definitions for. I'm going to say that value-based care is just the idea that what we want to pay for is switch to paying for is more the outcome than the input. We want to pay for health as opposed to simply financing the consumption of healthcare services, right? If we think about marching down that road, a lot of what we've done has been by contract. You've got an insurance company that signs a contract with the doctor for a bundle, for take care of these patients, for something along those lines. Often that insurer is the government, right? Medicare is signing a lot of these contracts through what you might have heard of before of accountable care organizations or ACOs, right? The idea is that if the doctor saves some money, they can keep a little bit, and Medicare gets to keep a little bit of the savings as well. What we've also started to find, though, is that those types of contracts often become very hard to write and enforce. And as we teach at Kellogg, right, that you can't always align incentives in a market through contract. That in a complex, changing, and uncertain environment, that might tilt you more towards integrating with another firm as opposed to doing something via an arm's length contract. And I think that's why you've seen this increasing amount of vertical integration in the market. I think it's why you've seen these primary care startups emerge, where they are signing a contract, but it's a very broad contract. I'm assuming all of the healthcare risk for this patient. And if I can lower it, then I'm going to be able to make more money. It's why you've seen also some combinations of these. With Humana, this is a great article today by Shelby Livingston at Business Insider from this morning's paper, whatever we call papers these days online, about Humana. And the degree to which Humana is really investing a bunch of money. And a couple of things jump out of this article. The first is they want to shape the healthcare future outside of the hospital. Right? The thing you might note as we go through these slides, there are no hospitals on these charts. This is all about keeping people out of the hospital. Further highlighting the point about needing to understand what we mean by the interconnected nature of healthcare. That if you're a hospital, you're a biopharma company, note that you're a cost center at times. My job in these models is to stop people from using your services. And so we see that. They're doing it by investing in some countries or some companies, right? Spending $8 billion to buy Kindred at home. They're also helping some of these upstarts like Iora or ChenMed or Oak Street Health, the people on the first slide, by both investing in them, but also sending patients there and collaborating with them. So as you start to think about the degree to which this world fits together, to which there's this interconnected nature of healthcare, the thing you have to come back to if you want to think about it is what creates value for you. It's right. This is true if you're in the market. As a payer, how do you create value? As a provider, as a biopharma company? As a patient, I think you're going to increasingly be forced to think about this as well by how you choose your access to physicians. You're going to see, I think, narrow networks that try and constrain where you go because of both prices and quantity. And so you need to think, what do you value? How much do you value having access to the academic medical center? What are you willing to pay for that? How much do you have value getting access to the latest, greatest drugs that are out there? But value will center this. And when we teach about the business of healthcare at Kellogg, we focus a lot on this. How do you create value? Because when you understand that, both how much and how you create it, you can see how you fit into this changing world. You understand the ecosystem and you understand your place in that. The other thing that you want to think about is that there are not going to be any simple single solution to this. Often people in healthcare think about the idea that we need this home run idea. This will be the thing that will fix U.S. healthcare. That doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. I used to play a lot of sort of beer league softball when I lived in DC. And the thing you found out pretty quickly is like singles win ball games. That's what we would talk about, right? Just move people around the base, do the work, move towards your eventual goal. If you're waiting for a home run, the odds are you're more likely to strike out than you are to have that success. And so as you think about your role in this evolving ecosystem, you want to take it bit by bit. Right? Think about what are the inefficiencies you see and how can you address it? And where do you, as a firm or as an individual, fit into this changing world? So thank you very much for tuning in. I think we're going to talk with Jessica now about some questions and some thoughts about what I had to say.
Thank you so much. We've got lots of great questions that have come in during the course of your presentation. So let's just get started. This is something, I'm going to start off with an easy yet complicated one that I know you've thought about a lot. You talked about increased vertical integration as being a part of the healthcare system right now. Do you think it will actually reduce costs?
So I think Jessica's right. That's a simple and a hard question, because a bit of sort of, I want to take it in two parts. And sort of as economists, I'm going to start with, like, what do you mean by costs, right? Do you mean we're going to consume fewer resources, or do you mean patients are going to spend less? Let's start with the first one of, do I think we're going to consume fewer resources? Do I think it's going to, maybe reduce prices or reduce care or something like that? This is going to sound like a namby-pamby sort of back out answer. I think it has the potential to do that. I think at a minimum, we are aligning incentives in the right way. I think that CVS buying Aetna, I think what we've seen United doing, I think these primary care startups are all aligning the incentives towards lower costs. And I would argue really getting a set of people who have the ability to control costs, also having the incentive to do so to a degree we haven't really seen in healthcare before. And so then he has the potential to do that. It's going to be hard. I should note. Where I supported the CVS and Emerge. I testified in Congress, I think it was a great idea. But I also noted there's a meaningful amount of sort of competitive or shareholder risk here. Can you do it? We see some early indications from people like Oak Street Healthcare that it's possible. It's possible in particular patient populations. It's an interesting thing when you think about this question that, Oak Street focuses on dual eligible Medicare beneficiaries. What that means is poor old people is basically what they're looking at. And they're going to do a set of things to help those people. It's probably not the same set of things as you need for rich people on the North Shore who are going to really expensive, North Shore, Chicago, who are going to really expensive hospitals. You need something else to deal with their high spending. So I think it's possible. And that said, I want to split into these two things. So could it reduce resource costs out or use? Possibly, yes. Will it result in patients spending less? That really does mean, though, that we need a competitive market for these vertically integrated providers for that to happen. I need not just that they're going to reduce costs, but that they're going to compete with each other for your business such that those cost reductions get passed along to the consumer. And so I still think we need, even in this vertically integrated world, even as business is attempting to solve the problem of high healthcare spending, we do need robust antitrust enforcement to make sure that there is competition among those individuals as well.
So I know you mentioned that this idea of the perfect patient shopper has pretty much not turned out as a lot of economists hoped in the last decade or so. How much of that is really just about the patient maybe not having access to all that information? So could transparency play a role in maybe turning us into slightly more ideal shoppers?
I mean, if your goal is to make us slightly more ideal shoppers, then yeah, potentially transparency has the ability to do that. I think there's no greater canard in healthcare than the idea that price transparency is going to solve what we do. We give people price transparency tools. We tell them what the price is. People don't seem to act like who I want them to be in my economic model. And I want to note that pains me in some ways. I can explain why it's the case. Right, there is a sense of information. There's asymmetric information. There's a cost to gathering that information. There's uncertainty baked in. We can figure out why this is happening, but it's not going to make someone necessarily a better shopper. And the more I think we talk to our non-economist relatives, the more we engage with the healthcare system, the more we see that this might not be the road to go down. There are benefits. There are ways that cost sharing, I want to note, can be used very effectively. If I've got two drugs that are fairly identical, think about like the cure for hepatitis C. So Gilead cures hepatitis C with Sovaldi and the Harvoni, and then we've got a bunch of products after that. The Carapac from AbbVie, we get Mavyret, we get a bunch of other products, and they're all like really good. We can argue what's better or not, but they're all great treatments, certainly compared to what we had before. Competition there drove prices down. And competition was saying, hey, listen, if you want to go use this other product and you're my customer as an insurer, you're going to pay $5,000 out of pocket, or you can use the drug that I think you should use. And so cost sharing in the face of competitive products, I think is really good as a negotiating tool for a payer. We just have to really always understand, why do we have cost sharing? Right? If every insulin on your formulary has really high cost sharing, we're not accomplishing anything. But if one of them does it and the rest do, Now maybe we can push back on pricing. And so you want to think about what you're using cost sharing for and how it actually interacts with the patient experience.
That makes sense. We have gotten a lot of questions about this. Who is left behind in our current healthcare system? And maybe should we be assessing quality, delivery, cost on a more nuanced level and sort of dividing the population up a bit as opposed to a single one size fits all, yes, healthcare in the US is or isn't working?
Yeah, so the question is clear that historically, for a variety of reasons, we have seen low-income individuals in the United States and minorities who are disproportionately left behind by the system. I get a question a lot in forums like other places of what's the best healthcare system in the world? I even took part in this like New York Times Olympics of healthcare systems. We got to vote on what the best healthcare systems were. And so that's a really hard question in the United States, given the level of inequality in our society, right? If you're wealthy and things have gone well for you, the bet's the United States. That's where you want to be. If you ask someone, though, this concept we often call the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, I'm not going to tell you who you're going to be in society. And now you've got to pick where you want to be. Well, Scandinavia is looking a lot better. Right? If I'm going to be very low income, that's where I want to be to get healthcare. And that's driven by the fact that historically, low income individuals in the United States have been left behind. And we have a very tortured relationship between African Americans and the healthcare system that have affected their ability to access care. I think we've seen a lot of that play out during the COVID vaccine. And I think we're trying to address that as well. That said, I think we are seeing business models emerge now that recognize that you can both earn money and help low-income people. And so I referred to Oak Street Healthcare, for example. There are other people like Centene. And now I'm going to take a second, Jessica, to plug some of our programming at Kellogg, even though this is an Insightful Leader event. Now, the program on healthcare at Kellogg is going to have a speaker series at the end of the month that is precisely about this question. What is the business of providing healthcare to low-income Americans? We'll be joined by people like Michael Niedorf, who's the CEO of Centene, David Menard, who's the CEO of the Howard Brown Healthcare System here in Chicago, Kate Baker, who's a leading academic here. We're going to be talking about this question, about addressing what Jessica, I think the questions probably have been about, which is sort of who's getting left behind, but also how do we think about developing business models to address that?
And I'm just going to help you plug this. It's completely free, right?
That is also true, yes, right? It's maybe not a great business model to make it completely free, but we really do want to just sort of get this information out there because I think that's sort of what the program of healthcare at Kellogg wants to think about is how do we use business fundamentals to make a better and more efficient healthcare system for everyone.
So here's another one that's come up a couple times. A lot of folks are interested in COVID. So how is COVID shaping the broader healthcare landscape here in the US? We had kind of a related one about the digital transformation, which has been accelerated by COVID, and how might that also be playing into things?
Yeah, so it's tough to be like giving you your 30-second answer on how COVID has changed healthcare in America, because I think COVID has changed everything in the United States. I would pick a few things out that I think are important to think about. Let's think on the sort of care delivery on the telehealth side. We obviously during the pandemic saw a big shift towards the use of telehealth. Now it's facilitated by some meaningful changes in how we pay for telehealth, particularly Medicare reimbursing these and then private insurers following along. And we saw this big uptake in telehealth. This has caused many people in the telehealth market to be like, this is the way of the future. You will never see your doctor again. I don't think that's true. I think we will see more telehealth than we had before. And that in this way, this sort of moved people to this new equilibrium where both doctors and patients got to experience this. And they realized, hey, this maybe isn't as bad as I thought it would be. But other people also find it's not as good as I thought it would be as well. And if you talk to physicians who are taking part in telehealth right now, they'll say they're getting a lot of patients that are explicitly requesting to see the doctor in person. Think back to what I said earlier. Being sick is scary. It's a personal relationship you have with your doctor. There might be things you need done, but certainly there's things you need done that you need to be in person for a physician, obviously. But there might be conversations you want to have where you want the warmth and empathy of seeing someone in person. And so I think it's going to become a complement to how we provide medical services, but not the primary modality. And there's lots of things where it's going to be really great for. So I think we'll see that evolve. I think it's also going to require, I just want to note, some pretty robust infrastructure built up around thinking about fraud in this space and that people might take advantage of that technology. And that's always been a worry we have. So COVID isn't going to change that. COVID also, I think, is going to shine light on some of the benefits of these alternative payment models that I was talking about. That if you are not having to pay, or if you are not getting paid as a doctor for every service you provide, but instead for sort of taking care of the patient, all of a sudden, right, when people stop coming to see you, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And so we've learned watching these sort of alternative payment model providers that there are benefits to moving away from the fee-for-service system just around income stability and things like that. And the final place I think we're going to have some conversations here, I think, is around the world of biopharmaceuticals. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this evolves. Coming into the pandemic, we had a huge national conversation about drug pricing. We've really had one for about 15 years, probably. And at that point, biopharma was polling at the bottom of every public opinion service. It's like below the government and below lawyers. These are not places that you want to be when it comes to sort of your net promoter score. There is no question that we are emerging from this pandemic faster and healthier than we otherwise would have because of the development of the COVID vaccines and other pharmaceutical interventions that I think will come along. And I think we full stop have to acknowledge that that is true. It has also led to a question, though, about what does that mean for the future of biopharma? Some people in industry and other places say, well, doesn't this buy us some goodwill? I think we're finding that it does to some degree, but the fundamental questions about how we're going to pay for things still are around, right? And so we're back to having drug pricing hearings on the Hill. I'll be doing one in the House next week. Like we're going to see these sort of these things happening. I think there's another sort of thing about biopharma that we're going to have, though, is that we want to make sure we're prepared for the next pandemic. I think you're going to see a lot more conversation about that. And I hope it is an intelligent conversation that is not, we need to be ready to make a vaccine for the next respiratory illness that we see, but that we need to think more broadly about how we think about pandemics and public health. It is quite possible the next pandemic will be a bacteria, it won't be a virus, that vaccines will be useful, that we will need an antibiotic product to deal with some type of antibiotic resistance that has emerged. And so we should be thinking about how we develop all of the antivirals and anti-infective treatments that we have to think about pandemics going forward, as well as investing in public health monitoring and other things that will make us more prepared for this going forward.
That leads me to a related question that might have been sent in with the pandemic in mind. Is it possible to create value in healthcare at both the individual and population levels, or are incentives at those two levels too different, especially with some of the more individualized therapies coming onto the market?
So it sort of depends what you mean by value, right? And there's a lot wrapped up in this question. So, I mean, at one level, we should note that while I'm a big supporter of market-based, sort of US-based healthcare, we should be intellectually honest and note that a single payer system does a better job of internalizing the population level health benefits. So if I am in the UK and as the National Health Service there, I know that I make an investment in you when you're 5 years old, it's going to pay off when you're 90. That's going to benefit me because I'm going to be paying for your healthcare when you're 90. We don't get that in the United States. We have this mixed public and private system where people are moving across insurers. So there are some ways in which, you know, it is possible to generate the value, but it might be hard to capture it as a firm if you're not the single national payer. I want to talk for a second about that last sort of statement, which is, I couldn't know if it was an aside or it was part of the original question, this statement about the sort of individualized treatments that we are getting, the precision medicine that is emerging. The fact that sort of treatments are tailored in a very narrow sense to a small patient population, do those generate value for only the people taking it, or do they generate value for the entire insurance pool? There's a lot of nuance to think about here. The one thing I would think about, though, I want to say that economists contribute to this conversation, is about what do we mean by value in healthcare? Right? There is clinical value, and that's often what people talk about for a drug. Right? So if your child was born with hereditary blindness, Spark's product Luxturna might allow that patient to see. And that is clinical value to that patient. But then there's sort of the value that that innovation exists at all. That if you're thinking about having a child who might end up with a hereditary condition, the fact that that can be treated has turned an uninsurable health risk. Whereas your child was born before this condition, this treatment exists, they would suffer death or impairment because of that, into an insurable financial risk. Because then we're just talking about the price of the drug. In that sense, even individualized treatments create value because the innovation itself acts like insurance. Right now, if Bill Gates, I guess it's more in his mind these days, I should pick a different example, but if Bill Gates has pancreatic cancer tomorrow, he's going to die of pancreatic cancer most likely. Odds are, right? His $120 billion, it's not going to matter, right? He faces an uninsurable health risk. And so the more that value is created, the more treatments that come out, the more we change things into insurable financial risks. And this is where I don't mean this to sound glib or offensive, where we get the luxury to fight about the price. Right? We lost my mother-in-law to cancer about 3 or 4 years ago now. And it was really hard for our family, and we would have paid everything that we had to have her live longer. Right? We didn't have that luxury to debate the price. The treatment didn't exist. And so I always think that that is the access problem and the value you want to keep in mind. That anyone who gets sick today with a drug that doesn't exist faces an access problem. There's no way to buy themselves out of that problem. And so I think that is value for every new innovation that comes to the market.
We've gotten a couple of folks who basically want you to read the tea leaves a bit here. Do you envision us moving away from an employer-based healthcare system? And so maybe we can broaden that a little bit, since I don't believe you have that ability, and just kind of say, what might that path look like?
I see no reasonable time period in which we're going to move away from employer-provided insurance. If we go back to the Affordable Care Act, if you remember, they were sort of the great lie: if you like your insurance company, you can keep it. That affected like 2 million, 3 million people. And then actually, let's be clear, we took very bad insurance away from them to give them better insurance. Most people like employer-provided health insurance. Now, people who support Medicare for All will say they like it because they don't know any better. Right? They don't know they could have a better product. When it comes to politics, I'm not a politician, but I would say you don't do a very good job telling people you're going to take something away that they like, but don't worry, it'll be okay. And so I just don't see a world where politically it's going to line up that we move away from employer-provided healthcare. I think Medicare for All is a tough world, because let's keep in mind that the biggest healthcare, or the biggest employer in every congressional district is going to be your local hospital. And so if you're going to take a bunch of money away from them, and let's be clear, you've got to take money from them to make the math work out here. I don't see that's going to happen. And so I think, though, that business and the healthcare business has really pushed society to the brink in some ways by the amount of money that they have demanded for these services. And that this attempt with vertical integration in these alternative payment models, this is business's shot to get this right. And I think it's why you need to concentrate on success here. You need to demonstrate how the market can work well, or we might in a period 10 years from now decide that's it. The benefits just simply aren't worth, the juice is not worth the squeeze here anymore. We're going to Medicare for All.
Well, that is a great place to end. I think it is 12:59.
Look at that. On time, Jessica. You never thought we could do this.
Thanks to everyone for attending the Insightful Leader Live. Thank you for all the really thoughtful questions. I wish we could have gotten to a few more. And thank you, Professor Craig Garthwaite. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. We will send out a video of this entire presentation in the next day or so. And finally, don't forget, next Thursday, May 20th at noon, come listen to us chat about innovation, even in the face of steep resistance. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys very much for coming.